I bought a bride, not a burden, snarled Baron Crask, and threw the words down in the cold drawing-room like a man flinging away a thing he has decided is worthless. And Harriet Sinclair stood very straight in the middle of the floor, with her little crippled sister's hand clutched tight in her own, and understood that she had just been cast off, penniless and disgraced, before a room full of strangers, because she would not abandon a child. The Baron had not minced it. He had bought up her dead father's debts and offered the bargain plainly, the debts cleared, the family saved, in exchange for the eldest daughter's hand, and Harriet, with no other way on earth to save herself and the helpless child who depended on her, had taken it. But she had taken it on one understanding, the only one she cared for. That little Daisy, her orphaned sister, lame these 3 years from a fever that had withered her small leg, should be kept and cared for as part of the bargain. And the Baron, discovering at the 11th hour that the child was no temporary charge to be quietly disposed of, but a permanent crippled dependent who would cost him keep and care for the whole of her life, had balked, had demanded, coldly, that the brat be sent away, to a charity, to a grudging distant cousin, to wherever such useless encumbrances were sent, as the price of the marriage. And Harriet, who would have walked into the fire sooner than give up her sister, had refused. And so the Baron had repudiated her, here, now, before his assembled guests, with that one contemptuous snarl that told the whole of his soul. I bought a bride, not a burden. He had paid for an asset, and found it came encumbered with a worthless one, and he flung the whole lot back as a man returns spoiled goods, careless of the ruin he made of a young woman and a child in the doing. Harriet did not weep, though her heart was breaking and her future was a black ruin before her. She gathered her dignity about her, the one possession the Baron could not strip from her, and drew little Daisy close, and prepared to walk out of that house into destitution with her head high, and her sister's hand in hers, having chosen, with her eyes open, love over safety, and her sister over herself. She did not see, in the cold buzzing room, the tall man by the window who had watched the whole of it, with a face like winter, did not know that the Duke of Wexford, the richest and the coldest and the most cynical man in 3 counties, had come to the Baron's house on a matter of business and stayed to witness a thing that moved him as nothing had moved him in years. For the Duke crossed the room then, in the appalled silence after the Baron's snarl, and did the thing that began this whole story. He named the Baron's price, the exact sum the Baron had paid to clear the Sinclair debts, in a cold, clear voice that carried to every corner of the room, and then he doubled it, and he said that he would pay that doubled price, there and now, for the lady's release from her bargain, and that the Baron might call himself fortunate to be paid twice over, for goods he was too great a fool to know the worth of. And he paid it, and he offered Harriet Sinclair his arm, and before the whole astonished assembly, the Duke of Wexford took the cast-off bride and her crippled little sister out of the Baron's cold house, and took them home. The repudiation in the Baron's drawing-room, seen from within Harriet's own breast, was the worst hour of her life, and the truest test of her. And it deserves to be felt, and not merely told. She had known, going into that house, that the matter of Daisy hung in the balance. She had known the Baron was displeased, had felt his cold displeasure gathering for days, but she had not let herself believe, until the words were actually flung at her, that he would do it, would cast her off publicly, before his guests, over the child. And when he did it, when the snarl came, I bought a bride, not a burden, she felt the whole ground of her life give way beneath her at once. For it was not only herself he was throwing away, it was the safety she had sold herself to win, the security for which she had swallowed every pride and borne every coldness, the whole hard bargain by which she had meant to shelter her sister. And in the single instant of that snarl it all collapsed, leaving her standing penniless and disgraced in a strange cold room, with her crippled sister's hand in hers and nothing before her but ruin. Another woman might have crumpled, might have wept, pleaded, even, at that last extremity, with destitution staring her in the face, given way, agreed to the child's banishment, bought back her safety at the price the Baron named. The temptation was there. In that terrible moment, the way back to safety lay open, and it cost only the abandonment of a crippled child. And Harriet did not take it. In the worst hour of her life, with everything she had fought for crashing down and ruin certain, she felt Daisy's small, frightened hand tighten in hers, and she knew, with a clarity that cut through all the terror, that there was no safety worth buying at that price, no security she would purchase with that coin, that she would rather walk out of this house into beggary with her sister's hand in hers than walk back into it alone, having sold the child to keep herself. And so, she gathered her dignity. The one thing the Baron could not take, because it was the one thing not for sale, and drew the child close, and prepared to walk out into ruin with her head high, having chosen, in the crucible of that public shaming, the thing she would always choose, the helpless one who trusted her, over her own safety, love, over price. She did not know, as she braced to walk out, that a cold man by the window had watched her make that choice and been pierced to the heart by it. She knew only that she had lost everything and kept the one thing that mattered, and that whatever became of her now, she had not failed the child. It was the lowest moment of her life, and it was also, though she could not see it then, her finest. The moment her unpurchasable worth shone out clearest, in the dark of her ruin, for the one man with eyes to see it. To understand how a gentlewoman came to be bought and cast off, and bought again, in a single dreadful hour. You must understand who Harriet Sinclair was, and what she had already lost, and the one thing she had left that she would not lose at any price. She was 23, the elder of 2 orphaned sisters, and her life had been a steady descent from comfort into ruin that had taught her, young, the whole hard arithmetic of survival. Her father had been a gentleman of modest means and pleasant, useless character, a widower who loved his daughters and managed his affairs badly, and when he died, suddenly, of an apoplexy, he left behind him 2 things, a tangle of debts far larger than anyone had supposed, and 2 daughters with no mother, no near relations willing to be troubled, and no fortune at all to live on. Harriet, at 20, had found herself the sole protector of a household that consisted of herself and her little sister Daisy, then 4 years old, and she had taken up that protection as the whole purpose and meaning of her life, with a fierce, devoted steadiness that nothing in the hard years since had shaken. For Daisy was the center of Harriet's world, and had been since the day their father died and left the child in her sister's keeping. She had been a bright, merry baby, and then, in her 4th year, a fever had taken her, not her life, but the strength of one small leg, leaving her lame, dependent on a little crutch, unable to run or play as other children did. Marked for life as one of those the world calls afflicted, and Harriet had nursed her through the fever, and loved her the more fiercely for the affliction it left, had become to the motherless, crippled child mother and sister, and whole family in one, had built her entire life around the care and the shielding and the cherishing of the little sister who had no one else in the world to love her. Whatever Harriet did, she did for Daisy. Whatever she bore for Daisy. And when at last the debts and the destitution closed in, and there was no honest way left to keep the 2 of them, but to sell herself in marriage to a man who would clear the debts, Harriet had done even that for Daisy, had agreed to marry the cold Baron Crask, a man she neither knew nor liked, for the one consideration that the bargain would keep her little sister safe. She asked nothing for herself, She had long since stopped expecting anything for herself. She asked only that the child be kept. And when the Baron refused the child, the bargain was, for Harriet, no bargain at all. For there was no price on earth. Not safety, not security, not rescue from ruin, for which she would buy her own comfort by abandoning the helpless little sister who trusted her. That was the one thing she would not sell. The one thing in all her hard-bargained life that was not for sale, and rather than sell it, she chose ruin. The childhood that made Harriet Sinclair the woman who would choose ruin over the abandonment of a child deserves its telling, for the steel in her was forged early, and it was forged, as the best steel often is, in love and loss together. She had been born to a pleasant, comfortable life, the elder daughter of a gentleman whose chief faults were amiable ones, a fondness for good company, a carelessness about money, an inability to deny himself or his children any pleasant thing. And her early years had been happy and secure, with a loving if improvident father, a gentle mother, and, when Harriet was 16, the late and joyful arrival of a baby sister. But the security was an illusion built on her father's heedless spending, and it did not last. Her mother died when Daisy was still a baby, worn out by a confinement that came too late in life, and a husband who gave her more worry than help, and Harriet, at 16, found the care of her motherless infant sister fall largely to her, and took it up with a fierce tenderness that was the making of her character. She half-raised Daisy from the cradle. The baby was as much hers as her father's. More hers in truth, for it was Harriet who tended and soothed and loved the little one through the years when their father drifted ever deeper into his careless ruin. And then came the double blow that ended her girlhood for good. When Daisy was 4, the fever came, the fever that the child survived but that left her lame, her small leg withered, her running and dancing days over before they had begun. And Harriet nursed her through it and wept over the affliction it left, and loved the crippled child, if it were possible, more than she had loved the whole one, with the fierce protective tenderness one feels for the hurt and the helpless. And hard upon the fever, within the year, came her father's death, the sudden apoplexy that carried him off, and revealed, in its wake, the full ruin of his affairs, the debts that swallowed everything, the destitution that faced his 2 orphaned daughters. So Harriet, at 20, stood alone in the world, with a crippled child of 4 wholly dependent on her. No money, no protector, and a mountain of her father's debts, and she did not break, nor despair, nor abandon the helpless little creature whom fate had left in her sole keeping. She set herself, instead, with the steady, fierce devotion that was her whole nature, to keep her sister safe at whatever cost to herself, and that devotion, forged in the love of a motherless baby and the nursing of a crippled child and the facing down of ruin at 20, was the steel that would one day make her choose destitution over the abandonment of Daisy, and refuse to be bought by any man at any price. The Baron took her for a desperate, biddable girl who would do anything to be saved. He did not know he was dealing with a woman who had already faced the worst the world could do, and had learned, in the facing, that there was one thing she would never do, whatever it cost her, which was fail the child who trusted her. Little Daisy deserves her own portrait, for she is the heart of this story in more than one sense, and the world that called her a burden was as wrong about her as it was about her sister. She was 7 when this tale begins, a small, slight, bright-faced child with her sister's fair coloring, and a sweetness all her own. The fever that had taken the strength of her left leg 3 years before had left the rest of her untouched. Her quick mind, her merry heart, her affectionate, confiding nature, so that she was, in everything but the one withered limb, as whole and as winning a child as any in England, and even the lameness which she bore with the uncomplaining matter-of-factness of a child who has known nothing else, had not soured nor saddened her, but only made her, if anything, the gentler and the braver. She got about on a little crutch her sister had made for her, hobbling cheerfully where she could not run, and had learned to find her pleasures in the things still open to her, in stories and games of make-believe, in the small creatures she could befriend, in the company of the sister she adored, and she adored Harriet with the whole of her small, fierce heart. For Harriet was mother and sister and whole world to her, the one fixed warm point in a life that had known much cold and fear. The world, of course, saw none of this. The world saw a cripple, a lame child, an afflicted one, marked with the visible misfortune that makes the thoughtless uneasy and the hard contemptuous. And the world, in the persons of Baron Crask and others like him, reckoned her by her affliction, and found her wanting, a defective article, a burden, a thing of no value and considerable expense. It is one of the cruelties of this world that it prices people so, that it looks at a lame child and sees a liability, at an afflicted soul and sees a burden, reckoning human worth by usefulness and cost, as it reckons the worth of a horse or a tool. And little Daisy, who was in truth a treasure, bright and loving and brave, was reckoned, by the cold accountants of the world, a worthless encumbrance, to be disposed of as cheaply as possible. But the world was wrong, as the world so often is about the things that matter, for Daisy's worth, like her sister's, was not a thing the world's reckoning could touch, was the worth of a human soul, beloved and loving, beyond all price and all affliction. And the whole moral of this story, if a fireside tale may have one, is bound up in the difference between what the world thought little Daisy was worth and what she truly was. The Baron cast her off as a burden, the Duke came to cherish her as a daughter, and which of them reckoned truly, the end of the story shows. The bargain with Baron Crask, and the manner of its souring, deserves to be told plainly, for it shows the whole character of the man, and the whole nature of the wrong from which the Duke rescued her. Baron Crask was a cold, hard, mercenary man of middle age, who looked upon the world and everyone in it as a market, and reckoned every person and thing by what it would cost and what it would fetch, and he had wanted a wife of the cheap, convenient kind, a young woman of good blood and no money, whose desperation would deliver her into his hands at a bargain price, and whose poverty would make her grateful and biddable. He had heard of the ruined Sinclair girls, heard that the elder was handsome and well-bred and utterly destitute, exactly the sort of distressed gentlewoman a careful man might pick up cheap, and he had bought the dead father's debts as a speculation. The better to have the daughter wholly in his power, and he had offered his bargain with the cold satisfaction of a man who knows his counterparty has no choice. He would clear the debts and marry the elder girl, and the matter of the younger he had passed over carelessly at first, assuming a child of 7 to be a trifling charge, the sort of thing that could be boarded out cheaply, or married off in time, or otherwise disposed of at small expense. It was only as the settlements were drawing up that the Baron learned the truth of the child, and the bargain soured in an instant. The girl was not a healthy 7-year-old who might be cheaply got off his hands. She was a cripple, lamed for life, who would need keep and care, and likely a servant to tend her for as long as she lived, and who would never marry, nor earn, nor be anything but a permanent drain on his purse, a burden, in the Baron's cold accounting, pure and simple, an unproductive expense fastened onto the bargain he had thought so shrewd. And the Baron, who reckoned everything by cost, balked at the cost, and demanded, with the brutal frankness of a man haggling over goods, that the burden be struck from the bargain, the child sent away to some charity or grudging relation, anywhere out of his sight and off his accounts, as the condition of his going through with the marriage. He did not see why he should keep a useless crippled brat that was no kin of his, and no use to anyone. He had agreed to take a wife, not to maintain an invalid, and if the elder girl wished the security he offered, she must rid herself of the encumbrance, for he would have a bride and not a burden, and there was an end of it. He put it to her as a simple matter of business, expecting the desperate girl to see sense and choose her own security over a crippled child's claims, and when, to his cold astonishment, she refused flatly, would not for any consideration abandon her sister, he was first incredulous, then contemptuous, then enraged at being thwarted in a bargain by what he could only regard as a sentimental folly, and he repudiated her on the spot, before his guests, with the snarl that gave this story its beginning. Baron Crask was worth a closer look, for he was the embodiment of a whole way of seeing the world. And it is worth understanding what manner of man can snarl that he has bought a bride and not a burden, and mean it. He was not, in the ordinary sense, a monster. That was the worst of him. He was something commoner, and in its way more chilling, a thoroughly practical man, a man of business and account, who had simply extended to human beings the same cold arithmetic he applied to everything else, and saw nothing wrong in doing so. He had made his way in the world by sharp dealing and careful reckoning, by knowing the price of everything and never paying a penny over the odds, and somewhere in the making he had ceased to draw any distinction between things and people, had come to see a wife as he saw a brood mare or a parcel of land, an acquisition to be valued by what it cost and what it would yield, a transaction to be driven as hard as any other. When he sought a wife, he sought her as he would seek any purchase, looking for the best article at the lowest price, and a destitute, well-born girl, desperate enough to be had cheap and grateful enough to be biddable, was exactly the bargain his careful soul delighted in. He felt no cruelty in it, for he meant none. He was merely doing business, and a woman to him was a thing one did business in. And so, when the bargain proved to carry a hidden cost, when the cheap convenient bride turned out to come saddled with a crippled child, who would be a charge upon him for life, he reacted exactly as he would have to any other concealed defect in a purchase, with the indignation of a man who feels himself cheated, and the cold resolve to repudiate the bad bargain. He did not see a frightened child and a loyal sister. He saw a defective article and an unexpected expense, goods misrepresented, a deal gone sour, and he flung the whole back with the same unfeeling practicality with which he would have returned a lame horse sold him as sound. "I bought a bride, not a burden" was, to him, a perfectly reasonable complaint, the legitimate grievance of a buyer cheated of his bargain. He could not for the life of him understand why anyone should think the worse of him for declining to keep goods he had not contracted for. And that was the true horror of the man, deeper than mere cruelty, that he had so wholly reduced the human to the transactional that he could cast off a woman and consign a crippled child to the workhouse and feel himself entirely in the right, a wronged party standing on his bargain, that he had priced the world so thoroughly that he had lost the very capacity to see worth at all. He was what the Duke of Wexford might have become, had the Duke gone a little further down the same cold road, and perhaps that was part of why the Duke, watching him, was so struck, seeing in the Baron's naked reckoning a caricature of his own cynicism, and recoiling from it, and beginning, in the recoiling, to change. If you are listening by your own fire tonight, the lamp low, the dark drawn close, the day's labors set gently down, then settle in, and let me tell you what became of the cast-off bride and her little sister, and of the cold, cynical Duke who bought their freedom on an impulse he did not himself understand, and learned, in the keeping of them, the one thing all his wealth had never taught him. For this is a story about price, and about worth, and about the great gulf that lies between the two. About a man who believed that everything in the world had its price and could be bought, and a woman who taught him, without ever meaning to, that the things most worth having cannot be bought at any price, but only given, and only freely. I shall tell you, before the end, where in the world I picture you sitting. But first you must understand the Duke, for he was no simple rescuing hero, whatever that day's deed might suggest, but a hard and a cynical man with a great deal to learn, and the learning of it is the heart of this tale. The Duke of Wexford was 36, and he was, by every outward measure, among the most fortunate men in England, master of a great title and a greater fortune, possessed of vast estates and a magnificent house and wealth almost beyond reckoning, wanting for nothing that money could buy. And there lay the whole trouble of him, for a man who can buy anything comes, in time, to believe that everything can be bought, and the Duke of Wexford had believed it for years. He had inherited young, and come early into the cold knowledge of what his wealth could do, had watched men flatter him for it, women pursue him for it, the whole world arrange itself around his money and bend to his purse, and he had drawn from the watching the cynical conclusion that everything had its price, that every man could be bought, every woman bought, every loyalty and friendship and profession of regard bought, if only one offered enough, and that the only honest way to deal with a world so constituted was to recognize the price of things and pay it coldly, and expect nothing that was not paid for. It had made him a hard man, and a lonely one, though he would not have called himself either. He was not cruel, as the Baron was cruel. He was something colder and more hopeless. A man who had ceased to believe in anything that could not be purchased, and so had ceased, without quite noticing, to believe in anything at all. He bought what he wanted and discarded what he tired of. He held the world at the length of his purse, paying for service and pleasure and society, and expecting no more from any of them than he paid for. He had never married, for he assumed any woman who took him would take his fortune and not himself, and saw no reason to pay so high a price for so cold a bargain. And he had grown, in his splendid wealthy isolation, into a man who valued nothing because he could buy everything, and was bored, at 36, with a world that had never once refused him anything his money could command. He had come to the Baron's house that day on a cold matter of business, expecting nothing and caring for nothing, and he had been arrested, against all his cynical expectation, by the sight of a thing his philosophy declared impossible, a young woman refusing, for love, a bargain that would have saved her, choosing ruin over the abandonment of a crippled child, valuing something above her own price. It had struck him, in his boredom and his cynicism, like a thunderbolt, and he had bought her freedom on the impulse of it, half in contempt for the Baron, and half in a wonder he did not understand, never dreaming that in paying her price twice over he was beginning the one transaction of his life that money could not complete. The loneliness of the Duke of Wexford, beneath all his wealth, was a thing few suspected, and he himself scarcely acknowledged, but it was the soil in which his cynicism grew, and it must be understood if his rescue and his change are to make sense. He had come into his title and fortune at 21, on the early death of his father, and had stepped at once into a world that wanted him only for what he had. He was young, rich, and powerful, and from the moment of his accession he had been surrounded by people whose interest in him was, he soon learned, an interest in his money, flatterers who praised him for his fortune, friends who borrowed it, women who angled for it, dependents who served it, a whole glittering crowd that pressed about the Duke of Wexford and cared nothing for the man inside the dukedom. A more foolish young man might not have noticed, a kinder one might have forgiven it, but Wexford was neither foolish nor, in those years, kind, and he had seen with cold, clear eyes exactly what he was to the world, which was a purse, and had drawn the bitter lesson to its bitter end. If the world wanted only his money, then the world could be had for money. If every regard shown him was bought, then every regard had its price, and the only sensible course, for a man so placed, was to recognize the fact, pay the going rate for what he wanted, and waste no sentiment on the fiction that anyone valued him for himself. So he had made himself cold, and made himself cynical, as a kind of armor against a world that wanted only his wealth, and the armor had done its work too well, for it had shut out not only the false, but the possibility of the true. Having decided that all regard was bought, he had ceased to look for any that was not, and ceased in time to believe any existed, having priced the whole world. He had lost the power to value any of it, and he had grown, by 36, into a man who could buy anything and treasured nothing, who held the whole world at the cold length of his purse, and was, in the midst of his magnificence, profoundly and unconfessedly alone. He did not call it loneliness, he called it clear-sightedness, the just reward of a man too wise to be gulled. But it was loneliness all the same, the particular barren loneliness of the very rich, who have ceased to believe that anything but their riches could be wanted of them, and it had hollowed him out, behind his cold splendor, into a man bored with a world that had never refused him and starved, without knowing it, for the one thing his money had taught him to believe did not exist: to be valued by someone for something other than his purse. That was the man who walked into Baron Crask's drawing room, and that is why the sight of a woman who would not be bought struck him as it did, like water on a parched ground he had forgotten was dry. The moment of the Duke's intervention deserves to be looked at closely, for it surprised no one more than himself, and the understanding of what moved him is the key to all that followed. He had gone to Baron Crask's house on a cold matter of business, some question of land or money, the kind of dry transaction that made up the substance of his days, and had meant to conclude it and leave, caring nothing for the Baron, his guests, or his affairs. He had been standing apart by the window, waiting with cold patience for the business to be got through, a bored rich man among people who bored him, when the scene erupted, the Baron's ugly haggling over the child, the cold demand that the cripple be cast off, and then the thing that arrested the Duke where he stood, the young woman's refusal. He had watched, with the detached attention of a connoisseur of human transactions, expecting the inevitable. The desperate, destitute girl would weep, would plead, would yield, would choose her own salvation over a crippled child's claims, as anyone in her place must, as everyone always did when the price was high enough. That was how the world worked. That was what his whole cynical philosophy predicted. Everyone had a price, and hers was about to be met. And instead, she had refused. Had stood there, penniless, with ruin before her and rescue offered, and chosen the ruin, chosen the child, chosen to keep a thing, her sister, her loyalty, her honor, that his philosophy said no one kept when the cost was their own destruction. It had struck him, in his cold boredom, with the force of a revelation, because it was, by the terms of everything he believed, impossible. Here was a person refusing her price. Here was a thing, call it love, call it loyalty, call it honor, that would not be sold though selling it meant salvation and keeping it meant ruin. Here, in a destitute girl in a drawing room, was the living refutation of the cynical creed he had built his whole hollow life upon. And something in the Duke of Wexford, some buried thing that years of cynicism had not quite killed, had leapt up at the sight of it. A wonder, an admiration, a sudden fierce contempt for the Baron, and everything the Baron stood for, which was everything the Duke himself had become. And on the impulse of that leaping, before he had reasoned about it at all, he had crossed the room and named the price, and doubled it and paid it, and taken her away. He could not, afterward, fully explain to himself why he had done it. He told himself it was contempt for the Baron, or a rich man's whim, or the idle impulse of a bored evening. But the truth, which he came only slowly to see, was simpler and stranger. That he had seen, for the first time in years, something that could not be bought, and had wanted, without knowing he wanted it, to be near it, to take it home, to have in his cold-bought house one thing that was not for sale, and that the impulse that moved him was not whim nor contempt, but the first faint stirring in a long frozen heart of a hunger his money had never been able to feed. He took them home, and here the propriety of the thing must be accounted for a duke cannot simply carry off an unmarried woman to his house, and the Duke of Wexford, cold as he was no seducer, and meant no dishonor. He had acted on impulse in the Baron's drawing room, and on the drive home, with the bewildered young woman and the frightened child in his carriage. He had time to consider what he had done and how it must be managed. His solution was characteristically swift and characteristically sensible. He sent, that very evening, for his godmother, the Dowager Countess of Storton, a formidable, shrewd, warm-hearted old widow of 72, who had known him from his cradle, was one of the very few people in the world he respected, and was moreover entirely unshockable and entirely her own mistress, and installed her at Wexford as the guardian of the proprieties and the protector of his unexpected guests. Under the Dowager Countess's chaperonage, all was made regular. Harriet and little Daisy were established at Wexford not as the Duke's dependents, exactly, and certainly not as anything dishonorable, but as the guests and wards of his respected godmother, housed and cared for and protected, their position rendered, if not quite ordinary, at least unimpeachable. The world might wonder, and the world did, but there was nothing in the arrangement that the strictest propriety could fault. The old countess's presence and patronage covering the whole with the mantle of her unquestionable respectability. But propriety, though it was satisfied, was not the half of what was in Harriet's heart, as she found herself, within a single day, swept from ruin in the Baron's house to refuge in the Duke's. She was grateful. How could she not be grateful? Rescued from destitution, her sister safe, herself sheltered, but her gratitude was shot through with a deep wariness and a deeper dread that she could not at first have named. For she had just been bought and sold once, had been treated, by the Baron, as a thing with a price, an asset to be acquired and discarded. And now another man, a far greater and richer man, had paid her price, paid it twice over, before a room full of people, in the coldest and most public way, and carried her off to his house. And the dreadful question that rose in her, under all her gratitude, was whether she had been rescued or merely purchased, whether she had escaped being the Baron's bought burden only to become the Duke's bought possession, whether this cold, magnificent man who had paid for her so spectacularly did not now consider that he owned her as the Baron had thought he owned her, and would expect of her the gratitude and the compliance and the belonging that the purchased owed the purchaser. She did not know him. She knew only that he had bought her, and a woman who has been bought once learns to dread the buyer, however fair his face. And so she came to Wexford rescued, but not at ease, sheltered but on her guard, resolved, beneath all her proper gratitude, upon one thing above every other, that whatever this Duke had paid for her, he had not bought her, that she was not for sale, to him or to any man, and that she would accept his shelter for her sister's sake, but would die before she would be any man's purchase again. The carriage drive from the Baron's house to Wexford was one of the strangest passages of Harriet's life, and it deserves recording, for in it the whole bewildering reversal of her fortunes pressed upon her at once, and she met it with the wary dignity that was her nature. She sat in the swaying carriage in the gathering dark, Little Daisy pressed close and frightened against her side, opposite the cold, magnificent stranger who had bought her freedom and was now carrying her she knew not where, and she scarcely knew whether she had been saved or seized. An hour before, she had been a cast-off bride facing destitution. Now she was, what? The rescued guest, the bought dependent, the kept woman, the ward, the prize of a duke's whim? She did not know. She knew only that her whole fate had been disposed of, again, in the space of minutes, by the will and the money of a powerful man, with no more consultation of her wishes than the Baron had given them. That she had been handed from one man's purchase to another's, and was being carried off to a strange house at the pleasure of a stranger, with nothing in the world to her name but the sister at her side, and the dignity in her own breast. It might be rescue. It might be a new captivity wearing rescue's face. She could not tell, and dared not assume the kinder reading, having learned too well what men who paid for women thought they had bought. So she did not gush her gratitude, nor fawn, nor weep with relief, as a more broken woman might have done. She sat straight in the dark carriage, and held her sister, and watched the stranger with steady, wary eyes, and when he spoke to her, gravely, civilly, telling her she need not fear, that she and the child would be safe, that all should be made proper. She answered with a grave, wary courtesy that thanked him for the rescue, while conceding him nothing of herself, and asked him, directly in a clear, steady voice, what he intended by them, and on what terms she and her sister were to understand themselves his guests, for she would know, she said, where she stood, having been lately deceived in a bargain and being resolved not to be deceived in another. It startled him, that directness, that wary, clear-eyed refusal to melt into a rescued woman's gratitude, and it was, though neither of them knew it then, the first note of the whole music that would play out between them. The bought woman who would not be owned, asking the man who had paid for her before she had been an hour in his keeping, to state his terms and respect her freedom. He had expected gratitude and got a wary equal demanding to know the terms, and the Duke of Wexford, riding home in the dark with the strange, dignified woman and the frightened child he had so impulsively acquired, felt the first faint intimation that he had taken into his house something he did not at all know how to manage, and that the simple transaction he thought he had completed was not, after all, going to be simple in the least. The first weeks at Wexford were a strange, slow taking of each other's measure, in which three things happened at once. The child Daisy began, for the first time in her hard little life, to thrive. The old countess took the sisters to her warm, shrewd heart, and the Duke, watching the woman he had bought, began to be baffled by her. Daisy was the easiest and the gladdest of it. The crippled child, who had known only poverty and fear, and the long anxious shadow of her sister's struggles, found herself suddenly in a place of warmth and plenty and safety, with kind people about her and good food, and a great house to explore at her own slow pace, and no one to call her a burden. And she bloomed under it like a plant brought into the sun, growing brighter and merrier and more confident by the day, her thin face filling out, her timid eyes learning to shine. The old Countess of Storton, who had a soft spot beneath her formidable exterior for anything small and brave, was charmed by the child at once, and made a great pet of her, and even the servants, taking their cue, were kind to the little lame girl who hobbled so cheerfully about the place on her small crutch. Daisy thrived, and Harriet, watching her sister safe and happy at last after all the hard years, felt the first easing of the iron anxiety that had gripped her heart so long, and was grateful to the Duke for that, at least, whatever else she feared of him. And the Duke, for his part, watched Harriet, and could not make her out. He had expected, insofar as he had thought about it at all, the ordinary behavior of a rescued dependent, gratitude, deference, the anxious wish to please that he was used to in all who depended on his bounty. The recognition, in short, that he had bought her rescue and that she belonged, in some sense, to him who had paid for it, and he got none of it. Oh, she was grateful, and said so, with a grave dignity. She was perfectly correct, perfectly civil. But there was in her no trace of the servility he expected, no anxious courting of his favor, no acknowledgment whatever that his money had given him any claim upon her. She met him not as a purchased dependent meets her purchaser, but as one self-respecting person meets another, with a quiet dignity that conceded him nothing beyond ordinary courtesy, and made plain, in 100 unspoken ways, that whatever he had paid, he had not bought her. It baffled him. And then, slowly, it began to fascinate him, for the Duke of Wexford had spent years among people who could be bought, and had come to despise the whole bought world, and himself within it, and here, in the woman he had himself paid for, was the one thing his cynical philosophy declared impossible. A person his money had not purchased, who took his shelter for her sister's sake, and gave him nothing of herself in exchange, who was grateful for the rescue but would not be owned by the rescuer, who had, it seemed, some core of self that was simply not for sale at any price. He had paid her price twice over, and she behaved, with perfect dignity, as though he had not bought her at all, and the Duke, who thought he had learned everything money could teach, found himself confronted with the one lesson it never had. The Dowager Countess of Stourton, whom the Duke summoned to make all proper, deserves her own introduction, for she became the fairy godmother of the whole affair, and her shrewd, warm presence shaped everything that followed. She was 72, the widow of an earl, and one of those magnificent old women whom long life and high birth and a fortune of her own had rendered entirely fearless and entirely herself. She had known the Duke of Wexford from his cradle, had been his mother's dearest friend and his own godmother, and had watched him grow from an open-hearted boy into the cold, cynical man he had become, with a private grief she had never troubled to hide from him. For she was one of the very few people in the world who had never wanted anything of him, being far too rich and too grand and too old to care for his money or his favor, and who therefore told him the truth, which was a commodity he received from almost no one else. He respected her as he respected no one living, and when, on the night of his impulsive rescue, he found himself with a young woman and a child on his hands, and the proprieties to consider, it was to her he turned, knowing she would come, would manage everything, and would not be shocked. She came, and she took in the situation at a glance, with the lightning shrewdness of her kind, and was vastly interested by it. A cold, cynical duke, who had never in his life done an impulsive or a generous thing, impulsively buying a cast-off bride and her crippled sister out of a brute's clutches, this was a development the old countess found extraordinary, and full of promise, and exactly the sort of thing to enliven her declining years, and she undertook the management of it with relish. She established herself at Wexford as the guardian of the proprieties. She took the bewildered sisters under her wing with a brisk warmth that did more than anything to set them at ease, and she watched, with the keen, amused attention of a woman who had read a great many such situations, and could see where this one was tending long before the principals could. The slow unfolding of the thing between her cynical godson and the woman who would not be bought. She saw the Duke fascinated, then smitten. She saw Harriet wary, then softening. She saw the whole love grow, and approved of it heartily, for she had wanted nothing for years so much as to see her cold godson's frozen heart thawed, and she judged, with her shrewd old eye, that this dignified penniless girl who refused to be bought was exactly the woman to thaw it. And when the scandal threatened, and the lovers faltered, it was she, of course, who took a hand and set it right, for she was that most valuable of all the figures in such a tale. the wise old woman who sees clearly, loves shrewdly, and is too old and too grand to be afraid of anything, and who therefore can do, at the crucial moment, what the young and the proud and the frightened cannot do for themselves. The blossoming of little Daisy at Wexford was one of the quiet joys of that strange season, and it did more than anything else to thaw the two grown hearts that watched it. The child had come to Wexford frightened and bewildered, snatched from the only home she knew, however poor, into a great strange house full of strange grand people, and for the first days she clung to Harriet and watched the world with the wary eyes of a child who has learned that change usually means loss. But children are resilient, and safety is a great healer, and Daisy had never in her short, hard life known real safety until now. At Wexford there was warmth, and plenty, and kindness, and no anxious shadow of debt or destitution. There was a great house to explore at her own slow hobbling pace, with 100 wonders in it. There was the old countess who petted her, and the servants, who were kind, and the grave Grand Duke, who, to everyone's surprise including his own, took to her. And above all there was, for the first time, the simple security of enough food, enough warmth, enough care, enough love, openly given, and not snatched in the intervals of struggle. And under all this the child bloomed as a starved plant blooms in the sun, visibly, daily, her thin face filling out, her wary eyes learning to shine, her natural merriment, so long suppressed by hardship, bubbling up and overflowing. And the two who loved her watched the blooming and were changed by it. For Harriet, it was the deep healing of her oldest wound. She had given up everything, faced ruin, refused a fortune, all to keep her sister safe, and here at last was the safety. The child she had fought so hard for thriving before her eyes, and the sight eased, by slow degrees, the iron anxiety that had gripped her heart since their father died, and let her begin, for the first time in years, to think of something beyond mere survival. And for the Duke, the child's blossoming was an education. He watched the crippled little girl the Baron had cast off as a worthless burden grow daily brighter and dearer under the simple application of safety and kindness. And he saw, as plainly as a thing can be seen, how wrong the world's reckoning of her had been, how the burden was in truth a treasure, the worthless child a fountain of sweetness and joy, the liability an asset beyond any price, and the seeing worked in him, who had priced the whole world so coldly, a slow revolution in his understanding of worth. If the world could be so wrong about the value of a lame child, could see a burden where there was a treasure, could reckon worthless what was beyond price, then perhaps the world's whole way of pricing things was wrong. Perhaps he himself, the great connoisseur of prices, had been a fool all along, valuing by cost what should be valued by worth, and missing in his cold reckoning everything that actually mattered. The child taught him that, simply by blossoming, and it was not the least of the lessons that remade him. The thing that turned the Duke's fascination into something deeper happened some weeks in, and it came about because he made, in his old cynical way, a mistake, the mistake of trying to settle with her, as he settled everything, by money. He had grown, by then, genuinely concerned for her future, and genuinely uncertain how to manage it, for he could not keep her at Wexford indefinitely, and he could not in conscience turn her out, and he had begun, moreover, to feel for her something warmer than concern, though he did not yet know it for what it was. And so he did the thing that came naturally to a man who solved all problems with his purse. He offered her a settlement. He came to her, formally, and proposed to settle upon her a sum of money, a handsome sum, a generous sum, enough to keep her and her sister in modest independence for life, so that she should be provided for and need fear destitution no more. He meant it kindly. It was, by his lights, a noble and a generous act, the discharge of his responsibility toward the woman he had rescued, the solving of her problem in the one way he knew. And he was wholly unprepared for her response. For Harriet refused it. She refused it gently and gravely, and with a dignity that struck him to the heart, but she refused it utterly. She would not, she said, take his money. Not because she was too proud to accept help, for she had swallowed her pride often enough in the hard years and would do so again for Daisy's sake if she must, but because she would not be bought. And she had come to understand that his money, however kindly meant, was a kind of buying. She had been purchased once, she told him, treated as a thing with a price, and she had resolved that it should not happen again, and to take a fortune from him, to be set up and provided for and made his pensioner for life, would be to become, in her own eyes if in no one else's, a thing he had bought and paid for and disposed of generously, and that she would not be, not for all his wealth, not to escape destitution itself. She would work. She would find a way to keep herself and her sister by her own honest effort, hard as it might be. She would accept his shelter a little longer gratefully, while she found her feet. And then she would make her own way, owing him thanks, but not herself. For there were things, she said, looking at him very steadily, that a person ought not to sell, however poor they were, and one of them was the right to belong to no one, and she would keep that one, though she kept nothing else. And the Duke of Wexford, hearing this, looking at this penniless young woman refusing a fortune sooner than be bought, felt the whole cynical edifice of his philosophy shift under him, for here, plainly and unmistakably, was a thing his money could not buy, a person his wealth could not command, a self that was simply, finally, not for sale, and he understood in that moment, with a force that shook him, that he had met at last the one thing he had ceased to believe existed, and that he wanted it, wanted her, with a longing no purchase could ever satisfy. The refusal of the settlement was the hinge of the whole story, and it is worth dwelling on what it cost Harriet to make it, for it was no easy gesture of pride, but a hard choice made in real need. Consider her position when the Duke made his generous offer. She was penniless, with no prospect of any honest livelihood that would keep both herself and a crippled child. She had a sister wholly dependent on her, whose lameness meant lifelong care and expense, and she was being offered, by a man of unimpeachable generosity, a fortune sufficient to keep them both in comfort and security for the rest of their lives, with no condition attached, but that she accept it. Every consideration of prudence, of practicality, of ordinary sense, urged her to take it. To refuse was to choose, deliberately, a future of hardship and struggle and uncertainty over one of comfort and ease, to turn down security for herself, and, far harder, for the crippled sister whose welfare was the whole purpose of her life, to embrace, with open eyes, the very destitution she had sold herself to the Baron to escape. It was, by every worldly measure, a mad refusal, the throwing away of salvation a second time. And a weaker or a more sensible woman would have taken the money and been grateful, and thought herself fortunate. But Harriet could not. For she had understood something about herself, in the hard school of the Baron's bargain, that she could not unlearn, that she had been treated as a thing with a price, and that to be so treated was a kind of death to her, and that to take the Duke's fortune, to become his pensioner, set up, and provided for and disposed of generously, a woman he had paid for and then paid off, would be to accept, finally and forever, the world's reckoning of her as a thing to be priced and purchased and settled, and to lose the one thing she had left, which was the knowledge that she belonged to herself. She would rather be poor and free than comfortable and bought, would rather struggle as her own woman than rest easy as a kept one. And she made the hard choice with her eyes open, knowing exactly what it cost her and her sister. Because there are some things a person cannot sell and remain themselves. And her own freedom, her own unpurchasable selfhood, was the thing Harriet had resolved to keep, though she kept nothing else. It was the same choice, at bottom, that she had made in refusing to abandon Daisy, the choice of a self that would not be sold over a safety that could only be bought by selling it. And it was that choice, made twice now at such cost, that revealed her to the Duke and to herself as a woman truly beyond price, for a thing that will not be sold at any price. Though selling it means salvation and keeping it means ruin, is by definition beyond price, and Harriet, refusing the fortune as she had refused the marriage, proved herself exactly that. After that, the Duke of Wexford began for the first time in his adult life to learn how to want something he could not buy, and the learning of it remade him, slowly, into a better man than his wealth had ever let him be. It began with a kind of humbling. He had offered her money and been refused, and the refusal, instead of offending him, had opened his eyes to her and to himself. He saw, looking at the woman who would not be bought, the whole poverty of his own rich life, how he had reduced every human thing to a transaction, bought what should have been freely given, paid for what should have been earned, and ended by possessing everything and valuing nothing, how he had become so used to buying that he had forgotten there was any other way to come by what he wanted, forgotten that the best things are not bought at all but given, and given only freely to those who do not try to buy them. And he resolved, awkwardly, like a man learning a foreign tongue late in life, to learn the other way, to stop trying to acquire Harriet Sinclair, and to try instead to deserve her, to win, by being worthy of it, what no money could command. It did not come easily to him, he had no practice in it. A man who has bought his way through life does not know, at first, how to court rather than to purchase, how to offer himself rather than his fortune, how to give rather than to pay. But he tried, and the trying changed him. He set himself, first, simply to know her, to spend time in her company and the Countess's and the child's, to talk with her, to learn the woman behind the dignity, and he found, as he had half begun to suspect, that she was worth the knowing beyond anything his cynical reckoning had prepared him for. He found a mind that met his own, and a spirit that did not flinch from it, a wit, a strength, a depth of feeling, a fierce tender loyalty that he watched daily in her care of her sister, and came to reverence. And he found himself drawn, too, and this surprised him most of all, to the child, for little Daisy, who feared no one and loved easily, took to the grave rich Duke who came so often now to the Countess's drawing-room, and the Duke who had never in his life cared for a child, who had indeed rather looked upon children as among the more tiresome of the things money could not make convenient, found his cold heart unexpectedly warmed by the merry crippled little girl who climbed fearlessly onto his knee and told him her small secrets and asked him to mend her broken toys. He came to love the child, the very burden the Baron had cast off as worthless, and in loving her, learned more of value and worth and the things beyond price than all his years of buying had ever taught him. For he saw that this small lame girl, whom the world reckoned a useless encumbrance, was in truth a treasure, loved and loving, worth more than all his acres, and not to be bought or priced or reckoned at all. And the man who had believed everything had a price. Learning to love a child the world called worthless, and a woman who would not be sold, was, without quite noticing it, becoming a man who understood at last what things are truly worth. The slow change in how Harriet saw the Duke deserves its own tracing, for she did not melt at once, nor easily. And the gradualness of it is what made it real. She had come to Wexford resolved to trust no man who had paid for her, and she held to the resolve, watching the Duke with steady, wary eyes through all the early weeks, alert for the first sign that he meant to be her owner. And for a time, the signs seemed ambiguous enough to keep her guarded. He was civil, distant, correct. He provided for her and her sister handsomely. He did not presume, did not press, did not behave as a man who thought he had bought her, but neither did he behave as anything else, and she could not at first tell whether his cold correctness masked a purchaser's patience or concealed something she had not yet learned to read. She kept her guard, and waited, and watched, and what she watched, by degrees, disarmed her. She watched him absorb her refusal of his settlement, watched the offer she had braced to fight, rejected not with the anger of a thwarted purchaser, but with a kind of struck, arrested respect, as though she had shown him something he had not known existed, and that was the first crack in her wariness. For a man who respects a woman for refusing his money is not a man who thinks he owns her. She watched him begin, awkwardly, to change his whole manner toward her, to cease treating her as a problem he had solved with his purse, and begin treating her as a person he wished to know, seeking her conversation, attending to her opinions, courting her good opinion as no purchaser courts a purchase. And above all, as the weeks went on, she watched him with Daisy, and that undid her guard entirely. For she saw the cold, grand, cynical Duke, who could have no possible motive of advantage in it, come to love her crippled little sister, saw him get down on the floor to play with the child, mend her toys with his own hands, listen with grave attention to her endless prattle, carry her on his shoulder through the gardens she could not walk, cherish the very burden that two hard men had cast off as worthless, and Harriet, watching, knew that she was seeing the truth of him, the real heart beneath the cold, cynical surface. For the way a man treats a helpless child who can do nothing for him is the one test that cannot be faked. A man might counterfeit regard for a woman he wanted. He could not counterfeit the patient, tender delight the Duke took in little Daisy, who could give him nothing, and whom he loved for nothing, and seeing it, Harriet's long wariness melted, against all her resolve, into a trust she had not meant to give, and then into something warmer still. She had been determined not to love the man who bought her. She had not reckoned on watching him love her sister, and it was Daisy, in the end, far more than any wooing of herself, who won Harriet's heart for the Duke by being the living proof that the cold purchaser had, after all, a heart worth winning. The Duke's attempts to court, rather than to buy, were, in those weeks, a study in a powerful man learning humility, and they were by turns clumsy, touching, and the truest sign of his change. He had no practice in it, that was the difficulty. A man who has bought his way through life, who has never had to win anything because he could always purchase it, arrives at 36 with no more notion of how to court a woman who cannot be bought than a child has of a foreign tongue. And the Duke of Wexford, who could have told you the price of anything, found himself wholly at a loss before the problem of how to make a penniless woman who would not take his money care for him. His first instincts were all wrong, and he knew it, and had to unlearn them. He thought of gifts, and remembered she would not be bought, and refrained. He thought of grand gestures, displays of his wealth and consequence, and saw that they would only remind her of the gulf his money made between them, and confirm her in seeing him as a purchaser. He had, in short, to set aside every tool he had ever used to get what he wanted, every one of which was a form of buying, and to learn, painfully and from the beginning, the one art his wealth had never taught him, how to make himself, the man, and not the fortune, worth caring for. And so he did the humble things, the things that cannot be bought and can only be given. He gave her his time, his attention, his honest conversation. He listened to her, which great men seldom do to anyone and never did to dependents. He showed her his mind and let her show him hers, and found, to his deepening wonder, that hers met his as no one's had in years. He was patient, undemanding, content to win her good opinion by slow degrees, and earn her trust by deserving it, asking nothing, pressing nothing, simply being daily in her company a better and a humbler man than he had been. And he courted her, too, through the child, not cynically, but because his growing love for little Daisy was real, and Harriet could not but be touched by it, the surest way to the sister's heart proving to be his unfeigned tenderness to the little one, though he did not court Daisy for that reason, but for the child's own sake, having genuinely come to love her. It was slow and awkward, and cost his pride a good deal, this learning to deserve rather than to buy, but it was the making of him. For in learning to win a woman who could not be bought, he was unlearning the whole cynical creed of his life, discovering that the best things must be earned and given and cannot be paid for, and becoming, in the discovery, the warm, worthy man that the cold purchaser had buried years before. The woman taught him, without trying to, simply by being unpurchasable, and the teaching gave him back his own lost soul. The friendship between the Duke and little Daisy deserves its own celebration, for it was the sweetest fruit of the whole affair, and the truest measure of how far the cold man had come. It began, as such things do, by accident. The child, who feared no one and whose affections were given freely and at once, simply attached herself to the grave Grand Duke as she attached herself to anyone who was kind to her, hobbling after him on her little crutch, climbing uninvited onto his knee, presenting him with her small treasures and her large confidences with the sublime assurance of a child who has never doubted her welcome. A colder man, or the same man a year earlier, would have been merely irritated, or coldly indulgent, but the Duke, already shaken loose from his old self by the child's sister, found himself, to his own astonishment, charmed, and then more than charmed. For there was something in the crippled child's fearless affection, given so freely and asking so little, that reached the starved place in him that all his wealth had never fed. Here was a creature who wanted nothing of his money, who did not even know what a duke was, who climbed onto his knee not because he was rich and powerful, but simply because he was there and was kind, and who gave him her whole uncalculating love for nothing, as a gift, freely. It was the first wholly disinterested affection the Duke had received in his adult life, and it melted him. And so the grand cold Duke of Wexford, to the wonder of his household and the slow undoing of Harriet's guard, became the devoted friend and playfellow of a crippled child. He mended her toys with hands that had never mended anything, he told her stories, and was told them. He carried her on his shoulder up the long gallery and through the gardens her lame leg could not manage. So that she might see the things other children ran to see, he had a little chair made for her, and a pony she could ride, and 100 small kindnesses devised to ease her affliction and widen her narrow world, all done not as charity to a burden, but as love to a child he delighted in. And in loving her, he learned more than any sermon could have taught him about the difference between price and worth. For here was the very child the world had reckoned worthless, the burden cast off by a man too cold to value her. And the Duke found in her a treasure beyond his whole fortune, a source of joy and tenderness, and meaning that no money could have bought, and that he would not have traded for half his lands. The Baron had looked at little Daisy and seen a liability. The Duke looked at her and saw a treasure. And the difference between the two men's seeing was the difference between a soul that prices everything and a soul that has learned, at last, to value. The child made the Duke a father before ever she was his daughter, and a better man in the making. And it was not the least of the gifts that this strange affair brought to a house that had been so long without love. And Harriet, for her part, watching the cold, cynical Duke thaw and soften and learn, against all his nature, to value what he could not buy, found her wariness of him melting by degrees into something she had never thought to feel for the man who had purchased her freedom. She had come to Wexford on her guard, resolved to be no man's possession, dreading that her rescuer meant to be her owner, and she had been disarmed, slowly, by the discovery that he meant nothing of the kind. She watched him absorb her refusal of his money not with anger, but with a kind of wondering respect, watched him cease, visibly, to treat her as a thing he had bought and begin, awkwardly and then more surely, to treat her as a person he wished to know, watched the cold transactional manner give way, by halting degrees, to something warmer and more human. A man relearning how to be a man rather than a purse. And above all she watched him with Daisy, watched the great rich cynical Duke get down on the floor to play with a crippled child, mend her toys, listen gravely to her prattle, come to love the very burden that two men had now reckoned worthless. And nothing could have undone Harriet's guard so completely as that. For the way a man treats a helpless child who can do nothing for him is the truest measure of his heart. And the Duke, cherishing little Daisy for no reason but love, showed Harriet a heart she had not known he had, and could not help but love him a little for the showing. So the love grew, on both sides, through that strange sweet season at Wexford, the cynical man learning to value, the wary woman learning to trust, the two of them drawn together over a child's laughter and a slowly melting reserve, each discovering in the other something the world had taught them not to expect. And it might have come, in the natural course of things, to a happy and a simple end. The Duke declaring himself, the woman accepting, the rescue ripening into love, had not two shadows fallen across it, the one cast by the world outside, which had not forgotten that the Duke of Wexford had bought a cast-off bride in a public scandal and was watching, and whispering, and waiting to see what he would do with her, and the other cast by Harriet's own deep dread, not yet wholly laid to rest, that for all his changing, she was still and always the woman he had bought, and could never be to him, nor he to her, anything that had not begun with a price. The world's shadow took the shape, before long, of Baron Crask, who had not done with them, and Harriet's shadow took the shape of a fear that one careless word could wake, and between them they brought the growing happiness, for a time, to the very edge of ruin. There grew, in the weeks before the scandal broke, a quiet companionship between Harriet and the Duke that was the sweetest part of their slow coming together, and that deserves its own remembering before the troubles came. It began in the evenings, in the old Countess's drawing-room, where the four of them, the Duke, the Countess, Harriet, and little Daisy until her bedtime, fell gradually into the habit of passing the hours together, and it was in those unguarded evening hours, more than in any grand gesture, that the two grown hearts learned each other. They talked. The Duke, who had spent years among people who only flattered him, found in Harriet someone who would argue with him, disagree with him, tell him plainly when she thought him wrong, for she owed him no flattery, having refused to owe him anything, and he discovered to his deepening pleasure that her mind was quick and her judgment sound and her conversation, a thing he came to look forward to through the dull hours of his day. And Harriet, who had braced herself against a cold purchaser, found instead a man who listened to her as no one had listened to her since her father died, who valued her opinions, who treated her words as worth attending to, and she felt, under that attention, something in her that had been long starved begin quietly to revive, the sense of being a person whose thoughts mattered, not merely a burden to be managed or a bargain to be driven. So they grew into friends before ever they grew into lovers, which is the soundest foundation a love can have, talking by the fire of an evening, walking in the gardens of an afternoon, with Daisy hobbling between them, falling into the easy intimacy of two people who find, somewhat to their surprise, that they like each other. The Duke learned her history, and reverenced the steel in her. Harriet learned his, and pitied the loneliness beneath the cold. Each came to see the other, not as a position or a price, but as a person, particular and dear. And the love that grew from such knowing was a love between equals, the only kind worth having, rooted not in gratitude or rescue or need, but in the simple, deep liking of two souls who had found, against all the odds of their strange meeting, a true companion in each other. It was this quiet, equal companionship, grown up unforced over many ordinary evenings, that made the eventual scandal so cruel. For it threatened a thing already real and precious, and it was this, too, that made the eventual happiness so sure. For a marriage built on such a friendship was built on rock. They had begun with a price paid in a cold drawing room. They ended as friends who loved each other. And all the distance between those two things was the distance the Duke had traveled from price to worth, and Harriet from wariness to trust, over the quiet evenings of that healing season. Baron Crask, it transpired, was not a man to be paid off and forgotten. For though the Duke had bought out his bargain and shamed him in his own drawing room, the Baron had brooded on the affair, and his brooding had curdled into a spiteful resolve to be revenged on both the woman who had defied him and the great man who had humiliated him. He could not undo what was done. The price was paid, the woman gone. But he could do what spiteful men can always do, which was to talk, and he set himself, with malicious industry, to spread through the county and beyond the most damaging possible version of the affair. He let it be known, everywhere he went, that the Duke of Wexford had bought himself a cast-off woman, had paid hard cash, before witnesses, for a bride another man had rejected, and carried her and her crippled sister off to his house to do heaven knew what with. He dressed the Duke's act of rescue in the ugliest colors, made of Harriet a woman literally purchased and kept, a creature sold from one man to another, and now living, under whatever thin cover of an old chaperone, as the bought dependent of a duke. And he scattered this poison wherever it would do most harm, in the clubs and the drawing rooms and the assemblies where reputations are made and broken, until the whole county was buzzing with the scandal of the Duke of Wexford and his bought woman. It was a cruel and a clever revenge, for it struck at exactly the thing Harriet most dreaded and could least defend, her dignity, her standing as a person rather than a purchase, and it threatened to make real in the world's eyes the very thing she had resolved never to be. And it worked its harm for a season, as such poison does. The whispers reached Wexford. The Countess heard them and was grimly angry. Harriet heard them and was cut to the heart. For the scandal seemed to confirm her deepest dread, that whatever grew between her and the Duke, the world would always see her as the bought woman, the purchased cast-off, and that she could never be anything else, never escape the price that had been set on her, never be valued as a person when she had been so publicly sold as a thing. And worse, it woke in her the fear she had been slowly laying to rest, that perhaps the world saw truly, that perhaps, for all his changing, she was to the Duke too what the world said she was, a purchase he had made, and was now, in his improved way, growing fond of, but a purchase still, that she could never know whether what he felt for her was the love of a man for a free woman, or the regard of an owner for a valued possession, and that to give her heart to a man who had bought her was to confirm herself forever as the thing she dreaded being. The poison did its work, and Harriet, wounded and afraid, drew back from the happiness that had seemed so near, and resolved, in her pride and her dread, to leave Wexford, to take her sister and go, to make her own way after all, to remove herself from the Duke's house and the world's whispers and the unbearable doubt, sooner than stay to be, or to seem, any man's bought possession. The depth of the wound the Baron's scandal dealt Harriet is worth understanding, for it was not mere wounded vanity, but a blow struck at the very thing she had fought hardest to keep, and it nearly drove her to throw away her happiness. The whispers, when they reached her, did more than embarrass. They seemed to confirm her deepest and most secret fear. For all through her growing closeness with the Duke, beneath the melting of her wariness and the warming of her heart, there had lurked a doubt she could not quite silence, that whatever passed between them, she had begun as a thing he bought, and could never wholly escape the fact that the world would always see her as the purchased woman, and that perhaps this was the unbearable part. Perhaps the world saw truly, and she was to the Duke too, in some corner of his heart he might not even know, a possession he had acquired and grown fond of, rather than a free woman he loved as an equal. She had no way to be sure. How could she be sure? He had paid for her. He had taken her into his house. He was rich and powerful, and she was penniless and dependent. Every circumstance of their situation whispered that she was the bought, and he the buyer, however kindly he behaved. And the Baron's scandal seized on exactly this doubt and blew it into a roaring fire, made the whole county say aloud the thing she most feared, that she was the Duke's bought woman, his purchased cast-off, kept under a thin cover of respectability, until Harriet could no longer tell whether the world was slandering her or merely stating, cruelly, a truth she had been refusing to face. And so the scandal drove her toward flight. She reasoned, in her wounded pride and her gnawing doubt, that she could not stay, that to remain at Wexford under such a cloud was to confirm it, to be in fact what the world said she was, that the only way to prove herself no man's purchase was to remove herself from the man who had purchased her, to take her sister and her dignity and go, to make her own way in poverty rather than stay in comfort as a kept and whispered of woman. It was the same instinct that had made her refuse the Baron and refuse the settlement, the fierce determination not to be owned, not to be a thing with a price, turned, now, by the scandal and her own doubt, against the very happiness that was almost within her grasp, for she could not see, in her wounded state, that to flee the Duke was to let the Baron's cruelty win, to throw away a real love for fear of a false name. She saw only that she was being called a bought woman, and could not bear it, and that flight seemed the only way to prove she was not, and she had very nearly gone, had her bags half packed and her resolve half set, when the old Countess of Storton, who missed nothing, took the matter into her own formidable hands and showed her a better way than flight to answer the world that had priced her. The way the old Countess turned Harriet from flight to defiance deserves recording, for it was a masterpiece of the particular wisdom that only age and shrewdness together can give. She found the girl with her bags half packed, and did not scold, nor plead, nor forbid. She sat down, instead, and talked sense, the bracing, unsentimental sense of a woman who had seen 70 years of the world and its cruelties, and knew exactly how they were to be met. Flight, she told Harriet plainly, was no answer. It was surrender dressed up as pride. If Harriet ran away under the cloud of the scandal, she would not escape it, she would confirm it. The world would say she had fled because the whispers were true, and the name of the bought woman would follow her wherever she went, fixed forever by her own flight, and she would have thrown away, into the bargain, a man who loved her, and a home where her sister thrived, all to escape a lie that her flight would only make people believe. That was not the way to answer a slander, the old countess said. The way to answer a slander was to face it down, to stand up before the very people who whispered it and show them, by one's bearing and one's truth, that it was false. To refuse to be shamed by a thing one had not done, and so to shame the slanderers instead. A woman with nothing to be ashamed of, she said, does not run, she stands. And Harriet had nothing on earth to be ashamed of, and everything to be proud of, and it was high time she stood up and let the world see it. And then the shrewd old woman laid out her plan, the great assembly, the gathering of the whispering county under the Countess's own unimpeachable patronage. Harriet presented not as a hidden dependent, but as the honored guest of the Countess of Storton, and the whole scandal faced down and turned in a single public stroke. She would dress the girl herself, she said. She would stand beside her. She would lend her the whole weight of her own ancient consequence, and Harriet had only to do the one thing the Countess knew she could do, which was to stand straight and tell the truth and be, unmistakably, before them all, the woman of dignity and worth she was. It was exactly the tonic Harriet needed, that bracing old voice telling her to fight rather than flee. It stiffened her wavering pride into resolve, turned her despair into defiance, and sent her into the great assembly not as a victim to be pitied or a culprit to be exposed, but as a woman come to face down a lie and own her own worth before the world. The Countess had seen, with her clear old eyes, that the girl's fierce refusal to be owned, which the scandal had turned self-destructively toward flight, could be turned instead toward triumph, if only it were pointed the right way, and she pointed it, with the deft hand of long wisdom, straight at the heart of the lie, and Harriet, so directed, did the rest herself. It was the old Countess of Storton who would not let her go quietly, and who engineered, with the fierce cunning of a clever old woman who has seen everything, the public reversal that turned the whole affair on its head. The Dowager Countess had watched it all with her shrewd old eyes, the growing love, the gathering scandal, Harriet's wounded resolve to flee, and she had no patience at all with letting a spiteful baron's lies drive two people she had come to love apart. She knew the world. She knew that a scandal of this kind could not be hidden from or fled from, but only faced down, met head-on and turned, and she knew that the only thing that could turn it was a public declaration, by the Duke and by Harriet herself, so unmistakable that the whispers could not survive it. And so she did what fierce, clever old women do. She took a hand. She bullied her reluctant godson into giving a great assembly at Wexford, a glittering public occasion to which all the whispering county was invited, the very people who had drunk in the baron's poison, and she dressed Harriet for it herself, and presented her to the assembled world not as a hidden dependent, but as the honored guest of the Countess of Storton, on the Countess's own arm, with the full weight of that formidable old lady's unimpeachable consequence behind her. And she contrived, the cunning old woman, that Baron Crask himself should be there, for she had heard he meant to come, to gloat over the scandal he had made, and she meant him to be present at its undoing. And there, in the great lit assembly room before the whole of the county, the thing was turned. The Baron, emboldened by drink and spite, made his move, said something, loudly, sneering, about the Duke's bargain and the bought woman, meaning to shame Harriet before them all, and confirm the scandal in the public eye. And Harriet, who had braced herself for exactly this, who had been brought to the very edge of fleeing, but had let the old Countess persuade her instead to stand and face it, owned that room as she had never owned anything in her life. She did not flinch, nor color, nor look away. She turned to the sneering Baron, and answered him, in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room, with the simple, devastating truth that he was quite right, that she had indeed been bought and sold, that he had bought her cheap and cast her off cheaper. The moment he learned, she came with a helpless child he would have had her abandon, and that she would say before the whole world, and gladly, that she counted it the best fortune of her life to have been found too dear a bargain by a man who reckoned a crippled child a burden, for it had freed her from him. She had been sold, she said, and was not ashamed of it, for the selling had been no act of hers, but of the men who thought a woman a thing to be priced. What she was proud of, and would be proud of to her dying day, was the one thing she had refused to sell at any price, which was her little sister. And if the world wished to despise her for having been bought, it might. She had her sister safe, and her own good conscience, and she would not trade either for all the good opinion in the room. And she stood there, having said it, straight and unashamed and magnificent, and the room that had come to sneer at the bought woman found itself, instead, looking at a woman no price could touch and no scandal could shame. The assembly at Wexford, where the whole affair came to its public reckoning, deserves to be seen in fuller detail, for it was the night Harriet Sinclair stopped being a thing that men priced and became, before the eyes of the world, a woman beyond price. The county came in force, drawn by the double lure of the Duke of Wexford's rare hospitality and the scandal they all expected to see played out, for everyone had heard the Baron's tale of the bought woman, and everyone came half to gawk at her. The penniless cast off the great Duke had purchased and kept. They found, instead of the cowed or brazen creature they had imagined, a young woman of quiet composure on the arm of the formidable old Countess of Storton, dressed with a simple elegance that became her, bearing herself with a dignity that gave the lie to every whisper before she had said a word, and the room, primed to despise, found itself unsettled, not quite able to reconcile the scandalous tale with the manifestly gentlewomanly figure before it. The old Countess had calculated exactly this. She moved Harriet through the company on her own arm, presenting her with the full weight of her ancient consequence, daring anyone to slight the girl she so visibly honored. And the whispers, faced with the reality, faltered, and then came the moment the Countess had foreseen and prepared for. Baron Crask was there, had come, as the old woman had known he would, to enjoy the scandal of his making, and, emboldened by wine and spite, and the sight of the woman who had defied him standing proud, where he had thought to see her shamed, he could not contain himself. He made his sneering remark, loud enough for the room, about bought goods and the Duke's curious bargain, meaning to puncture the girl's composure and confirm his tale before them all. The room held its breath. And Harriet, who had braced for exactly this, who had been talked out of flight and into facing it by the old Countess's bracing wisdom, did not falter, or flush, or look away. She turned to the Baron, and in the sudden silence, she answered him, clearly and without a tremor, owning the whole truth and turning it inside out. Yes, she had been bought and sold. Yes, he had bought her cheap and cast her off the moment he learned she would not abandon a crippled child. And yes, she counted it the great good fortune of her life to have been reckoned too dear a bargain by a man small enough to call a child a burden. She was not ashamed of having been sold, she said, for the selling had been the act of men who thought women were things to be priced, and the shame of it was theirs and not hers. What she was proud of was the one thing she had refused to sell, which was her sister, and she would not trade that, nor the clean conscience it had cost her so dear to keep, for all the good opinion in that room or any other. And she stood there, having said it, and let the room look at her, and the room, which had come to see a bought woman shamed, saw instead a woman whom no price could touch and no shame could reach, and was silenced, and then, here and there, ashamed of itself, and the Baron's sneer died in the air, and the scandal with it, and then the Duke of Wexford, who had stood listening with his cold face alight, did his part, and his part was the undoing of his own old self as much as of the Baron's scandal. He came to stand beside her, before them all, and he spoke, and what he said was a public confession and a public homage at once. He told the assembled county that the Baron was indeed correct on one point and wrong on every other, that he, the Duke of Wexford, had paid money in the Baron's drawing room and would do it again 10 times over, but that any man who imagined he had thereby bought the lady was a greater fool even than the Baron, who had at least had the wit to know, in the end, that she was beyond his purchasing. He had not bought a wife that day, the Duke said. He had paid to free a woman from a man who thought her a thing to be priced, and the freeing of her was the best act of his life, and the only part of it he was proud of. And then he turned from the room to Harriet herself, and said the rest before them all, since the world had made the matter public, and the answer should be public too, that he had spent his whole life believing everything could be bought, and had been taught better by a woman who could not, that he had tried, in his folly, to settle a fortune on her, and been refused, and thanked God since for the refusing, which had shown him what she was, that he did not want a bought wife, and never would. Did not want her gratitude or her dependence, or anything that money or rescue could command, but wanted only the one thing in the world his wealth could not buy, which was her free heart freely given, and would count himself, if ever he won it, richer than all his fortune could make him. He had paid her price twice over to a fool, he said, but her worth was beyond all price, and he knew it now, and would spend his life proving that he knew it, and would never again, so long as he lived, offer to buy what could only be given. It was a complete vindication, and a public one, before the very people who had come to despise her. And it fell upon the room, and upon the routed Baron, and upon Harriet herself, like the breaking of a long-held tension into light. The scandal could not survive it, for the Duke of Wexford had stood up before the whole county and declared the bought woman beyond price, and his own past folly the only shame in the affair, and after that, no whisper of the Baron's could stand. The Baron, exposed and outfaced, left the assembly in cold fury and was little seen in that county again, and the world, which an hour before had been ready to despise Harriet Sinclair as a purchased cast-off, went home instead, marvelling at the Duke of Wexford's strange public homage to a penniless woman, and more than half persuaded, as the Duke had meant it should be, that there must be something very much out of the common in a woman who could bring the coldest and richest man in England to speak so. Harriet was vindicated, the Baron was routed, and the only thing left unsettled, when the great assembly broke up, and the whispering county went home, was the one thing the Duke had said only she could settle, whether she would give what he had sworn he would never again try to buy. He came to her the next day, and made her the offer that was the opposite of a purchase, and Harriet, free at last and valued at last, made the choice that was hers alone to make. For the Duke had understood, at last and completely, what he must do, and it was the hardest thing his cynical transactional soul had ever attempted, which was to give without buying and to ask without owning. He did not come to her with a settlement, nor with the weight of all he had done for her, nor with any of the claims a man who had rescued and sheltered her might have pressed. He came, instead, to set her free, wholly, finally free, freer than she had been since her father died. He told her that he had that morning made over to her, irrevocably and with no condition whatsoever, a sum sufficient to keep her and her sister in comfortable independence for the rest of their lives, not as a settlement upon a dependent, not as a payment or a claim, but as a free gift with no strings of any kind, hers absolutely, to take and go where she pleased, and owe him nothing. That she was now, in law and in fact, an independent woman, dependent on no man, able to make her own way in the world with her sister beside her. Free of him and of every man, exactly as she had wished to be. He had bought her, the world said. Well, he said, now he had unbought her, had made her free, with no price on her and no claim upon her and no debt to anyone, so that whatever she chose now, she chose as a free woman and not as a purchase, and no one, least of all herself, could ever again call her bought. And then, having freed her, he asked her to marry him, not as her rescuer, not as her creditor, not as a man to whom she owed anything, for he had just discharged every claim and set her wholly free, but simply as a man who loved her, asking a free woman, who owed him nothing and could walk away that hour with her fortune and her sister and her head high, whether she could find it in her heart, of her own entirely free choice, to love him and to stay. He had spent his life buying, he told her, and this was the one thing in all his life he would not buy and could not buy and did not want, except as a gift, her hand, her heart, her free self, given freely or not at all. And Harriet, free now, truly free, holding in her own hands the independence that meant she need never be any man's purchase again, able to refuse him and walk away into a comfortable liberty, looked at the man who had freed her sooner than own her, and weighed it with the clear, honest heart that had refused to be bought by anyone, and found that she loved him. Loved him, not because he had rescued her, nor because he had freed her, nor out of any gratitude or need or obligation, all of which he had carefully discharged, but simply and freely because he was, beneath the cold cynicism she had watched him shed, a man worth loving, who had learned to value what he could not buy, and had freed her rather than keep her, and she gave him her answer, freely. From the strength of a woman who chose where she would bestow herself, and bestowed it now of her own free will, that she would marry him, not because he had bought her, for he had not, but because she loved him, and chose him, freely as a free woman freely gives her heart, and that he might have the one thing his fortune could never have purchased, for nothing, as a gift, because she wished to give it. The freeing of Harriet, the Duke's irrevocable gift of independence before ever he asked for her hand, was the act in which his whole transformation came to its point, and it is worth understanding why it was the one thing that could win her. He had grasped by then the central paradox of his situation, the thing his cynical philosophy had never prepared him for, that the more he did for Harriet, the less able she was to come to him freely, that every benefit he conferred, every rescue and shelter and provision, while kindly meant, only deepened the obligation that made a free choice impossible. That so long as she was dependent on him, owed him, was in any way bought or kept or beholden, she could never give him her heart as a free gift, because it would always be in doubt, to her most of all, whether she gave it freely or paid it as a debt. He wanted her free love, and her love could not be free so long as she was not free. And so he saw that there was only one way to make a free gift of her heart possible, and it was the hardest and most generous act his transformed soul could conceive, to make her free first. To discharge every claim, cancel every debt, remove every dependence, to give her, with no strings whatever, the means to live independently of him forever, so that she stood before him not as a rescued dependent who owed him everything, but as a free and independent woman who owed him nothing and could walk away that hour, and only then, having made her wholly free, to ask, knowing that whatever she answered, she would answer freely, as a free woman, and that if she chose him it would be a gift, and not a payment, and if she refused him, he would have to let her go. It was the precise opposite of buying her, and that was its whole power. The Baron had tried to own her by purchase. The Duke had begun by the same error, paying her price, half thinking he had bought her rescue and her gratitude. But he had learned, and his final act was to renounce ownership altogether, to use his wealth not to acquire her, but to free her, to spend his money for the express purpose of making her able to refuse him, to lay down every hold he had over her sooner than hold her by anything but her own free choice. It was the act of a man who had learned at last that the thing he wanted could not be owned, only given, and who wanted it given so badly that he would make himself unable to compel it sooner than receive it on any other terms. And it was, of course, exactly the act that won her. For in freeing her, he proved beyond all doubt the thing she had needed to know and despaired of knowing, that he did not want to own her, that he valued her freedom above his own desire to keep her, that he saw her not as a possession to be secured, but as a free soul to be loved, and a woman who had resolved never to be any man's purchase could give her whole heart, freely and without fear, to the one man who had proved he would rather set her free than buy her. The freeing was the winning, the renunciation was the victory, and the Duke of Wexford, who had spent his life buying, got the one thing he truly wanted only in the moment he gave up forever the attempt to buy it. They were married before the summer was out, and it was as happy a marriage as ever grew from so strange and so cold a beginning. For it had been founded, in the end, on the one thing that makes a marriage last, which is a thing freely given on both sides, and bought by neither. The Duke of Wexford was a changed man, and stayed changed. The cold cynic who had believed everything had a price became, under the slow, warm influence of a wife he had learned he could not buy, and a child he had learned to love for nothing. A man who understood at last the difference between price and worth, and valued accordingly, he grew warmer, kinder, less the lonely purchaser of a world that bored him, and more a man rich in the things no money buys, a wife who loved him freely, a home that was a home, a small adopted daughter who climbed fearlessly onto his knee. The wedding itself, when it came, was as quiet and as joyful as the beginning of the affair had been public and cold, and the old Countess of Storton counted it the crowning satisfaction of her long life. There was no grand display. By the wishes of both, the Duke had had his fill of the world's watching, and Harriet had never wanted spectacle, and so they were married quietly, among the few who truly cared for them, in the small old church near Wexford, with little Daisy strewing flowers from her small chair, and the old Countess beaming in the front pew like a general who has won her campaign. And won it she had, for it was she, after all, who had made the rescue proper, who had set the lovers at their ease, who had turned the girl from flight to defiance and stage-managed the great vindication, and who had watched her cold, cynical godson thaw at last into a happy man under the influence of a woman he could not buy. She had wanted nothing for years so much as to see that thaw, and to sit in the little church and watch him wed his penniless love with the cherished crippled child between them, was a joy she had not looked to know again at 72, and she savored it to the full. As for the Baron, he had his answer too, though he was not there to see the wedding. His spiteful scandal had recoiled upon him. The county that had heard his tale of the botwoman had seen, at the great assembly, the woman herself face him down, and the Duke declare her beyond price. And the county had drawn its own conclusions about which man had behaved basely, and the Baron found himself, in the months that followed, quietly but unmistakably shut out, uninvited, unwelcome. A man known to have cast off a gentlewoman and a crippled child for the sake of his purse, and then slandered them out of spite. He had bought a bride and lost her. He had thought to ruin her, and ruined only himself. And he passed out of the story, as such men do, into a cold, mean obscurity, never understanding to the end what he had thrown away, or why the world thought the worse of him for it. He had known the price of everything and the worth of nothing. And he ended, fittingly, with all his prices and no worth at all, while the woman he had cast off as a burden became a beloved duchess, and the child he had scorned a cherished daughter, in a house grown warm with the one thing his money had never been able to buy. For little Daisy was the great gladness of it all. The crippled child, whom two men had reckoned a worthless burden, became, in the house of Wexford, a cherished and beloved daughter to them both, her lameness no bar at all to a love that valued her for herself. The Duke, who had never thought to care for any child, doted on her as on his own, and saw to it that the best of everything that could ease her affliction and gladden her life was hers, not as charity to a burden, but as love to a treasure. The burden the Baron had cast off as worthless turned out to be, as the truest things so often are, beyond all price. And the house that had received her gave her, in place of the workhouse the Baron would have sent her to, a father's love and a great home and a happy life. There is a deeper thing in this story worth drawing out before we leave it, and it is the difference between price and worth, which the whole tale turns upon, and which the world is forever confusing. A price is what a thing will fetch, worth is what a thing is. The two are not the same, and the gap between them is where most of the cruelty and most of the folly of the world lives. Baron Crask knew the price of everything and the worth of nothing. He could tell you to the shilling what a destitute bride might be had for, and what a crippled child would cost to keep, and he reckoned by these prices, and called it good sense, and so he bought a woman cheap, and cast off a child as a burden, and never once saw that the woman was beyond price and the child a treasure, because he had no instrument in him for measuring worth, only price. And the Duke of Wexford began as a subtler version of the same man, not cruel, but cynical, a connoisseur of prices who had priced the whole world and lost the power to value any of it, who believed that everything could be bought because he had never met anything that could not. The whole of his redemption was his slow passage from price to worth, from a man who asked of everything what will it cost, to a man who learned to ask what is it worth, and the teachers of that passage were a woman who would not be sold, and a child the world called worthless, the two of them showing him, between them, that the things that matter most have no price at all, being beyond the whole economy of buying and selling, and can be known only by a faculty quite different from the one that reckons cost. For the deepest truth of it is this, that every human soul is beyond price, and that to put a price on one, to buy or sell or value a person by what they cost or fetch or yield, is the fundamental error from which cruelties like the Baron's flow. Harriet knew it, with the unteachable knowledge of those who have been priced and refused the pricing. It was why she would not sell her sister, would not sell herself, would not be bought even to escape ruin, because she understood in her bones that a soul that consents to be priced has lost the thing that makes it a soul. And the Duke learned it, late but truly, at her hands and the child's, learned that the woman he had paid for could not be bought. The child the world threw away could not be priced, and the love he wanted more than all his fortune could not be purchased at any figure, but only given, and only freely, by a free soul that no money could command. And carry this out of the tale, if you carry anything, that you are not for sale, whatever the world will pay for you, that your worth is not your price, and that the best things in this world, the only ones finally worth having, were never on the market at all. And what of little Daisy, in the years that followed, for a story that turned so wholly on a child cast off as a burden, owes it to her to say what became of her when the burden was found to be a treasure. She grew up at Wexford a cherished and beloved daughter, and there is no sweeter justice in the whole tale than that. The child the Baron would have sent to a charity or a workhouse, the lame little girl two cold men had reckoned worthless, became the adored darling of one of the great houses of England, loved by a mother who had given up everything to keep her, and a father who had chosen her freely. Her affliction, no bar at all to a happiness as full as any whole child's. The Duke, who had learned through her the difference between price and worth, lavished on her not the grudging keep the Baron had begrudged, but the whole of a father's love and a great man's care. He saw to it that the best physicians eased what could be eased of her lameness, that the cleverest craftsmen made her chairs and crutches and contrivances to widen her world, that she had teachers for her quick mind and companions for her merry heart, and every good thing that love and wealth together could give a child. And she repaid it all, as such children do, 1,000-fold, growing into a bright, accomplished, warm-hearted young woman, lame still but lamed in nothing that mattered, the joy of the house, and the living proof that the world had been wrong about her worth. For that was the truth the whole story had been driving at, made flesh in the person of one small girl, that the world's reckoning of worth is so often, so cruelly, so completely wrong, that it looks at a lame child and sees a burden where there is a treasure, at a destitute woman and sees a bargain where there is something beyond all price, and reckons by cost and usefulness, and yield the things that can only truly be reckoned by love. The Baron had priced little Daisy and found her worthless, and the Baron had been wrong as a man can be, for the child he threw away grew up to be worth more than all his careful accounting, beloved and beautiful, and a blessing to everyone who knew her. The burden became the treasure she had always been. The worthless child became a cherished daughter. And the cold house of Wexford, which had bought a bride by accident and gained a family, learned through one small lame girl the lesson the whole world is forever needing to learn, that there is no such thing as a worthless soul, that every person the world prices and finds wanting is in truth beyond all price, and that the love which sees this and acts on it is the one wealth that no fortune can buy and no misfortune can take away. So bank your fire now, and turn your lamp low, and let the dark draw gentle and close. A cruel man bought a bride and cast her off, because she came with a burden he was too small to value, and a cold man paid her price twice over and took her home, and learned, in the keeping of her, that the woman he had bought could not be bought at all. Nor the child the world called worthless reckoned at any price, and so the buying and the selling of human souls was answered, in the end, by the one thing that is not for sale, which is love, freely given. Somewhere tonight, by some fire I shall never see, you have watched a woman who would not be sold, and a child the world threw away, and a hard man who learned what things are truly worth, and I am glad of it, more glad than I can say. And I should dearly love to know where in the world you are listening from. Remember, when next the world tries to put a price on you or on anyone you love, that the things most worth having were never for sale, that no soul has a price however the world may haggle over it, and that your own worth is your own, entire and beyond all reckoning, whatever any man will pay for you or refuse. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit.